identity in Africa is very important. Ukuthi ubani, uqhamuka phi, uzalwa phi. I can most speak Zulu and all of that.
Yes, please.
Yeah, but for me, and this is what we shared when we spoke the last time, is it's basically heredity. Yeah, and it's got at the fundamental level, a biological foundation. As we said, for there to be a baby, there has to be two participants, and each of those participants have, biological, I don't want to call them legacies, but they've got a bit of biology that they give you, and in my understanding, infused in their, how do I call them? Because I'm trying to find the English word, but it's escaping me. But ubaba no mama kunezipho abakunika zona to create the life that is you. And kulezo zipho, there's a lot to understand biologically, but it's got a lot of spiritual reference to it as well. So I wanted us to go first on the biology and then on the spirit. And I'm saying spirit because, this is the famous word for now, but it always goes beyond that. So as a first point of departure, I think let's talk genes, let's talk DNA, let's talk chromosomes, and then let's go from there.
A biology class.
Let's go biology.
A biology class. So good.
So before there is life that is you, there's the life of your parents. Ne? We all are famous of how they come together and they give birth to you as a baby. That's biology. I don't want to use the names that we normally use, but ubaba wako gives a bit of himself, umama wako gives a bit of himself. And Mina always say, I don't know whether it's 8 days or 12 days from conception to the first beat of the heart. Okay. Yeah, but there's a period where I think the universe decides whether you are going to be or not.
Okay.
And I think that's
whether the fertilization is happening or not.
Yeah, whether they're going to pump life into this biology that has been created. Okay. So there's quite a few days. It doesn't happen instantly, and it happens later because as soon as your heart forms and starts beating, and then there's a bit of time. And I think that's where my fate and your fate is decided. Okay. So, okay, we've got the instructions from Ubaba, we've got the instructions from Umama. Now we need to decide what this life is going to be. Okay. Yeah. So what normally happens with human beings, we've got DNA. I'm not sure if you're familiar with DNA. The genetic instructions from your parents that actually, from their parents and then we'll go through the tree just to get a bit of detail. But you get genetic instructions from your father, you get genetic instructions from your mother, and then these are the instructions that later develop your heart, your lungs, your body,
your nose,
the color of your skin, your hair, and all of that. These things are very precise. So this DNA is very precise. But how this DNA is formed, it's formed in a form of chromosomes. I don't know how they came up with the name chromosomes, but there's the X and the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome is it's not symbolic because it's always found in the male. So it's always found in your father. But I don't want to say it's masculine because once you say it's masculine, then it gets associated with a whole lot of things. But the Y chromosome is associated with your father. Sorry. Your paternal, and your X chromosome is associated with your mother, your maternal chromosome. So there's those chromosomes. Y from your father, X from your mother. A few scientific facts about the chromosomes. First, let's define chromosome. Chromosomes are a set of genetic instructions. Yes, so they carry the code that says later we will need a nose, later we will need an ear, later we will need this. And I mean,
They determine that this is a human being, this
first
is
and
a
foremost,
cat,
yes.
this is...
Yes, and there's a suggestion that we share more or less 93% of the genetic, material with the rest of the species in this world. 93.
I believe that.
And in terms of our closest relative, I think the chimpanzee shares about 96% of our traits and our genetic codes. And that's why they always say, you're acting like a monkey. It means you are back to your basic genetic behavior. So you have your Y from your paternal, you have your X from your maternal. Very interesting things about these chromosomes. And they are actually shaped like a Y and an X, right? Yeah. The size of the X chromosome is 3 times the size of the Y chromosome.
Okay.
That's a scientific fact. So the paternal chromosome is very, very short. 3 times smaller than the size of the X chromosome.
Okay.
That's one very interesting fact. And the second interesting fact, which for me has got a lot of spiritual connotations, is that in the Y chromosome you have about 60, if not 55 genes. So genes are, if you have a strand of DNA, a section of that DNA becomes a gene, right? So this gene is actually the code that says, okay, we're gonna need this ingredient to make this tissue, to make this organ. Yeah, so the gene is actually a set of code necessary to create later a protein or whatever.
Okay.
So you have...
About 21, 20...
That's later at a cell level, yeah.
Okay.
So for now, I'm saying on the Y chromosome, on the father chromosome, you have 55 to 60 genes.
Okay.
So you basically have 55 to 60 sets of code. Yes. On the mother chromosome, the X chromosome, there's more than 1,000.
Interesting. You go back to biology.
There's more than 1,000. And if you think about it, does it mean, is that how, and I know that this might be a funny word, is that how pregnant femininity is?
Without being pregnant, without actually carrying a child, it's perpetually pregnant with life.
Exactly. I mean, that's how much life is in the female form, if I were to put it like that. So what then later happens with these chromosomes, these genes, is that when life grows, obviously after conception, so these genes would interact. So the father chromosome would interact with the mother chromosome, certain codes would come together and say, okay, let's go build a heart, let's go build a brain, let's go build a this. So they work together. Without the other, they don't really, do a good job. And that's why we have deformity and sometimes conception that doesn't come into life, because these codes are not aligning, yes. So that's what happens. So you have these inheritances, genetically, biologically, from your parents. One thing I wanted to mention here, which is very, very important, is that from these 2 packages, sets of code, your life is already determined biologically. So from within that 8 to 12 days or however long it takes to build a heart, a human heart, these instructions carry all possibilities for your life. And that's where when people talk about uzelwe to fulfill a certain destiny or whatever, I'm like, biologically it's true. Because once your parents gives these chromosomes, you cannot be anything outside of whatever they've given.
Of whatever that aligning determined.
So your mother cannot be pregnant with a cow, for instance. So it's already decided that you're going to be a human being, right? And your mother cannot give birth to you. You are African, right? Maybe it can happen, but I'm just saying, according to biology, you cannot come out Chinese unless in those sets of code there is
That's Chinese.
No.
And it also managed to make its way into
exactly
that
activate, because they call it cell activation, where another one is deactivated and this one is activated, and that's why people show more of a certain trait than I said. Sometimes someone is too light, is too dark, because as those instructions were coming together, one was more active than the other. It always comes back to chemistry and all of that. But what I'm saying is, from these two packages, the X and the Y chromosome, you already decided. You're going to be short, you're going to be tall, you're going to have this hair, So you cannot go outside of that.
It's just now a matter of you being born and living, but it was determined then.
Biologically, that's you. Right? Yes. So my observation then becomes, okay, since we know genes cannot exist without spirit, because life is organic matter plus that additional element. Right now, me and you are breathing, are alive, because there's matter that is not organic that exists within us, and that's why once that matter goes, we're no longer alive. And I was talking to someone and saying, okay, mawukhuluma ngomzimba, it's almost as if you have to talk about umoya as well, because once umzimba ungabi nomoya, it's not umzimba anymore, and esizulwini sinegama elithi isidumbu. But once uthi umzimba, there is a presupposition that then nomoya ukhona. That, for me, that's my observation with chromosomes as well. To say, in as much as there's biological and genetical heredity, there's also biological, spiritual and non-biological heredity. In as much as you inherited biological instructions to build this body, you also inherited spiritual instructions from your mother and your father to build the spiritual you now.
I'm so way ahead now, and I know you'll get there. But I'm already now was speaking about spiritual heredity and how we as parents, also because maybe our parents, somewhere along the line, we forgot our spirit, but the heredity of it. Because maskumanga heredity is something that you cannot run away from. It is encoded into you, into us. That is why it's taking me so far. It's taken me to where we have, ordinarily there would be rites of initiation, or there would be rituals to introduce our children to spirit as we know it, to spirit as we practice it. I'm already at introducer. In my opinion, this is how we introduce our children to who they are spiritually. But in this conversation, spiritual heredity, it starts way before that. Yes. It starts, because if it's hereditary, then you are born with it. It's out of you. It's out of you. There's nothing you can do about it. It takes me to already thinking about the things that the reasons and the things and rituals or ceremonies as well that we do, that were done as soon as, or that we are meant to facilitate as soon as we know that now there's been a life that is starting in the womb of the mother. Now this is now heredity, and also there is also now their responsibilities outside of this life, outside of the biology. There's things that actually are supposed to be put in place, or were put in place, to actually make sure that not only the body is fed, but the spirit also, yes. Towards, I know I'm so way ahead, but I know you're going to get there.
We're going to get there.
I know you're going to get there. Towards.
So it's true when I Gogo, and that's where you look at African awareness in the form of African spirituality, and you realize there were no microscopes, there were no surgeries to go to the atomic level, to the cellular level, but somehow the observation and the understanding was there to say, I can't see your cells, I can't see your genes, but I know there has to be activation of those genes for you to align. Hence, imbeleko. I call rituals, especially coming of age rituals and all of those things, activation points. And we'll talk about activation points later, because since life is multidimensional, we have to assume that at a certain point some dimensions cannot overlap. So if there's a beam of intention from one dimension, there has to be an acknowledgement of receipt to say we saw your signal and that's why rituals. But I think we were still at chromosome level. So I think the level of biological hierarchy goes, so you have your DNA, you have your chromosomes, and your chromosomes is strands of DNA packaged together, and these are biological and spiritual instructions for me and you. We have to emphasize the spiritual element. And then from your chromosomes, you have your cells. So now in each and every cell, there's normally 23 pairs of chromosomes. For humans, that is. I mean, we're talking about humans. We can talk about other species, but I think for now, let's talk about humans. And when I say pairs, I'm saying, so each chromosome has paired up with another one so that there can be activation and therefore life. And for me, that's where duality is born. That's where the opposite ends of the spectrum are born. The one needs the other, good and bad, evil and good, male and female, etc. and so forth. Once the instructions are there, if it needs to grow beyond, just genes into life, then it has to split between two. So each and every human cell has got 23 pairs of chromosomes. Yes, and the 22 are the same for everyone. The 23rd is the one that makes you different, and only a small portion of it, I think it was like 3% or something. So the difference between me and you is a genetic 3%. And look how different we are.
But essentially we are the same.
And it's even worse when you look at, humans and plant, humans and animals. And that's why when you really, really get into what is called today African spirituality, you realize the level of awareness is just super. But we'll talk about that.
I'm actually looking forward to that conversation that I'm looking forward to.
So I'm saying you have human cells, 23 pairs. People who are lazy to explain then will say, no, you have 46 chromosomes. It's paired up together. Yeah, and the 23rd chromosome is actually the one that determines your gender. It says whether you are male or female. So with male kids, you have both the X and the Y chromosome present. Right?
Yes.
Now we're getting to the surname part of it. With female kids, you have the X and the X chromosome present. Don't ask me why.
You didn't trace these things, but that's what it is.
Boys are X and Y, girls are X and X. Remember, boys, your father had an X and a Y. So when he was participating in the creation of the life that is you, he donated his X chromosome and your mother donated her X chromosome. And that's why as a female you have two X's on the 23rd pair instead of an X and a Y.
Okay.
Do you get it now? No, you don't.
Your father, my father, not yours, not just yours. My father did not
Gave
only
you his X?
he gave his X,
Your mother gave
her
you her
X.
X. Yes.
But he also gave his Y.
To who? Females don't have Y chromosomes. Do you understand me?
Females don't have Y because there was nothing to pair with the X, the Y.
No. Two X's can pair together, and that's the one biological fact that needs to inspire you to appreciate females. Two X's can pair together and create a life.
But now we're talking now. There's my mother and my father.
Yeah.
And my father brought his X.
Mm-hmm.
Why would he not bring his Y along? His Y also came along, did it not?
No, it's biology. Remember, okay, let me explain again. 23 pairs, right?
Yes.
22 are the same. The 23rd determines your gender. Biology says, and this is existence, it's not experience, it's how things are biologically. You as a female, on the 23rd pair, you have two X's. Me as a male, on the 23rd pair, I have Y and an X. That's the gender difference between me and you, sitting at the 23rd pair. I've got an X and a Y, you've got
an X and an
X. That's biology. As to why it's like that, or why your father didn't give you his Y, that's now an experience we can discuss later. But how biology is, and I mean, I would call it a scientific law. It's almost like gravity. It is. Yes, it is what it is. And if we were, I want to say lazy, but if we were, if we have limited time, we would say that's how God created it. But obviously, we've got more time to discuss. So I think we need to move from there now.
Okay.
I'm a male, and in my cell, in my 23rd pair, I've got an X and a Y.
Okay.
You are a female. In your 23rd pair, in your cell, you've got an X and an X. So you've got more than 2,000 genetic codes to create life. I've got 1,060 or 55. So already
imbalance. There's already an imbalance. And so this imbalance, because there's so much of the female. I'm interested in how we get to. That's where we're getting to now. In now the biology of the surname. Why now? Because I bring so much, not only in chromosomes, also in womb, in the precaring of the child.
Your ability to make a human being comes from the abundance of your genetics.
Yes, and then my child. Then I carry the child. Not only do I carry, but I feed, I nurture. Everything about me is centered around this person. But then, no, not just biologically, because it's now not a biological matter, the determination of what surname is used. And then the child becomes a Mazia.
Before we get there, I need you to appreciate the genetic and spiritual abundance of the different sexes.
I think I'm there, but break it down, okay?
To appreciate it, there is, and in size and in quantity, the two most important measuring metrics: size and quantity. In size, remember, this is 3 times shorter than the X. The Y is 3 times shorter than the X. So physically, you are taller. And in terms of quantity, you are more as a female. And I'm emphasizing that because I need you as someone who is sangoma, who's got a dimension beyond just body, to appreciate that difference. It's biological. It's how it is, and it does not interpret into females are better than males and all of that. But I just need you to appreciate the abundance of life in the female form.
The biology of it.
It's there. It's there. And when you later, talk about females and the power of the feminine, you can always trace it back to
Biology.
genetics. You know? All right, so we have the X and the Y. We accept that you have two X's, I've got two Y's. Surnames. Right? Surnames. What are surnames to start with, Gogo? I think we need to get into that first before we then explain the biology of it.
Yes.
For me, surnames are identities, right? Identities that are necessary to say, okay, I see everything, but I need to look at that focal point. So I'm looking at the trees, I'm looking at the grass, but now I need to look at Gogo Simenjalo. So for me to do that, I need to identify Gogo Simenjalo. I need to focalize and pinpoint my attention to you. And for me to do that, I need to identify, right? So that immediately all my energy goes there. So for me, identity is that. To know, what am I experiencing? What is this experience? So for me, that's identity. And at the level that we're talking surnames. So now your surname becomes a way of saying, this is my experience. So who am I? For you to focus on who am I and therefore experience me, you need to identify me, right? And that's where first the identity comes from. But since we know from the discussion about heredity and genes and all of that, you are not Gogo Simenjalo, just. You have a background. You have an origin. You have a place where you come from.
Which forms my identity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Genetically, we've traced it. Mother and father, now you. But again, in as much as we're talking biology, we also have to talk perception, the mind. So how do I say now, okay, I'm alive, I'm breathing, but what am I experiencing? And that's why I can call that a tree, but if you were to go ask the tree, what are you? It wouldn't say it's a tree. It will explain itself based on its
in the way it identifies itself.
Exactly. And this is where the surname becomes important. Who am I experiencing this moment with right now? You would say Qeli. And then it needs to go back to, okay, who is Qeli?
Yes, and it's actually now become a thing, because for a very long time, I think my identity crisis for me it started at 23. And then at 27 it came to full bloom. That is when I was now writing. I was actually writing about who am I, trying to explain myself, who am I to myself, so that I could understand who I was. And it became a whole writing, because just I could not explain myself in a sentence, in a paragraph. It took me to as far back as I possibly could go, and that is what also made me then curious about the things that I didn't know.
Where you come from.
Yes, because I knew that this entity is not just this. It's informed by all those other things. Besides my experiences, the experiences of the people who brought the people, who brought the people, who brought the people, who brought me. It became very intense, because at that time I was also now a mother. So my starting to ask myself, I think those questions also came about not only because of the experiences, but also because of how of my children, one, and how I could do right by them, and how I could make sure that they know who they are, and that they live their best lives based on. Because then I knew, when I started asking that question and trying to answer that question, that my children are not a totality of me and their fathers. They're not a total. It goes beyond that. That is when this thing was came alive in me. Because I'd always, even when my people passed on, I always had a way to keep them alive in myself. There was a way for me. It just was natural in keeping the people that had passed on alive, because I knew that they were part of me. I knew that they formed, that my identity was linked to theirs, whether they were gone or not. I think that's why then I started feeling, I started making, subconsciously, making myself a space in which they would be comfortable to settle, to be. Because it was not really for me, it was to make sure that my children are okay, and that they carried in them and with them everyone that had been there. And now, mind you, I was still very Christian. It was not even about ancestors, or it was just plainly ancestry.
Back to your roots.
It was just ancestry and me understanding who I am, so that my children would understand who they were. So,
Well, Gogo, I mean, already you have given to your kids your genetic identity, right?
the genetic, yes.
Yeah, I'm sure you look like your mother, who looks like her mother or her father, whatever. But it goes back to, you look like the people that gave birth to you. And as I look at you now, I mean, I can see some of those ancestors, and you've given that identity to your kids as well. How it becomes important then is, how does that identity harmonize with their lives, and adds to them trying to go on their own journey now? Because heredity eventually has to project you to become the life that was initially intended for you to become, not by other people but by yourself as well. Yeah, we'll talk about how you actually decided to be a Sangoma before you came here later, yeah. But it's not like you were absent from that conversation. You were part of that conversation. But I'm saying, as you give your kids your identities, it was something that was given to you. So it's a continuation of something that has already been there at a biological dimension. But there's also the intellectual, the mental, the perception of it, which is our idea of who we think we are. And if that is not in alignment with the biology, that's where identity crisis comes from. The biology says you are this, and then your psychology says you are that. It's even worse when your spirituality says you are that. You are going to be all over the show. And that's what identity crisis is. Biology says something different, and. So our work as healers is Zangoma, is to harmonize everything. But we need to understand the foundation of the harmony to build on, which is the genetics, the biology. And that's why we need to understand, how surnames comes to Abantu. So going back to now what a surname is, right? So we've already spoken about the biology of it. So now we talk about the psychology of it. I know I'm a human being, I know you're a human being. We need to have an experience, right? And for us to have an experience in harmony with our bodies, we need to say, okay, this is a female, this is a male, this is a tree, this is a what. And hence that whole thing. And it's very interesting to see, especially from the biblical perspective, when I think it was Genesis chapter 2, when it says God made a man and then he put him in the garden. The first thing he does, he says, identify.
Give names to these things that you see around you.
Otherwise, you are not going to be orientated. You are going to be disorientated. You are not going to function if you don't identify. And that's why identity becomes now, someone has decided to join us.
Yeah.
That's why now identity becomes an important next step after understanding the biology. To say, and that's what makes us different from other species, is that as soon as we can feel the air in our lungs, then we go on. The second next important thing is to identify. And that's where surnames comes in. So you're a female, I'm male. So, but who are you? Who am I having this experience with? And then the idea of giving you an identity that extends to who you are comes from. Names. First, before there are surnames, there has to be names, right? So your name is Qili. And that's why I now say, okay, when I'm talking about Qili, I'm not talking about the air, I'm not talking about the trees, I'm actually talking about this existence.
And it's actually weird how in that is how I preferred to be known. I preferred to be known as Qili.
Yeah.
Because it was shorter, it was my full name is Qili. It was long, and it's for a long time it embarrassed me.
It has a memory attached to it.
It embarrassed me because for me it was it's a name that was mainly used, was a boy's name. So for me it was like, why was I named Qili? Why could they not just call me Qili because they call me Qili? But why give me a name that could...
Why were you thinking about
that
it?
is mainly... I don't know.
You couldn't just accept it.
And then also my other name is Njabulo. It's also a guy's name. So for me, I actually had this thing with growing up that they actually really want a boy when they had me. Is that why I was given boys' names? But you see, these are the things that we go through as children.
So the identity crisis started way before.
Based on a name. Just based on just a simple name.
Okay. So I've got now the name Qili as... Okay, so it says this is who I'm having the moment with. But Qili is not Qili from Norway. And hence the surname. So there's the name that says this is the person, and then there's the surname that says this is where they come from.
This is the person who comes from.
Yes. So I know what memory you are bringing into, the Ntlengetwas and whoever's that are part of this identity, I would get from your surname. Well, it's got a whole different African historical, story to it. But for me, that's where names and surnames are coming from. Names identifies you, and your surname gives me, your background, your origin, your ancestry, your memory, if we were to make it a biological topic, right? So now you ask, but now why do I have to get my father's surname and not my mother's surname? That one is a bit of, and I called it the last time we spoke, it's, and I kept trying to find, words that have, the same feeling as this weather. But there's no other way of explaining it except that it's a toxic interpretation of the X and the Y relationship. It's a toxic interpretation of the X and Y relationship. How do I mean it? The X chromosome has got more, what's the biology? Mutational properties than the Y chromosome. First, because it's bigger, and secondly, because it's got more, remember, it's got more genetic code. Whereas this one is more rigid. Okay. Because it's shorter and it's got less, it's more like a master key. Okay. The Y chromosome mean that it can only use these 60 genes and that's it. Whereas this one can variate between 1,000 and depending on how it switches what, and it's got so much life possibility. So now, me and you've got two X's, I've got an X and a Y, we decide to start a family. Right? We decide to start a family. Let's say we have two kids, right? We have a boy and we have a girl. So we've got an X and a Y, we've got an X and an X, right? And then they decide to have kids. She has an X and an X and an X and a Y. And I hope you're keeping up with the boy-girl thing. So she has a boy and a girl too. He has two girls.
Okay.
What happens to his Y chromosome going forward?
Because now he's got two girls. It stays with him.
And then he perishes, God forbid he dies whenever.
And then it's no longer recognized in those, because he's got two X's.
This Y chromosome is dead.
It's dead, yes.
And then what happens to my legacy?
It dies with
to my
you.
continuation.
It dies with your son who got only 2 X's, who brought 2 X's to this life.
Do you then see the emphasis on the boy child and his importance on
Continuity.
continuing this legacy, this memory through what is the scientific name for making babies? Procreation.
Procreation.
Exactly, that's the word I'm looking for. Due to that realization to say, okay, if I don't give birth or if I don't reproduce, more of my Y chromosome is going to die. And therefore, I need boy kids to guarantee my legacy, as they call it these days. And scientifically, the Y chromosome has been shrinking and shrinking. And you can see by the sheer numbers of our population, there's more females in our population than in our, with our males. And even the quality of the Y chromosome.
It's also shrinking.
Yeah,
It's shrunk.
scientifically, I mean, I think at some point we had more genes than the 60 that we have now. So we were actually, as the Y chromosome was mutating, it was shedding more and more genetic instructions. And obviously, with scientific, scientists and pessimism, they would say it means in the next whatever billion years we're not going to have males anymore. And once you get rid of males, what happens to procreation?
It stops. That's
Exactly.
the end of it.
But someone early in African life made that observation and in a toxic manner then says she's not as important as he is if we are to sustain ourselves. Hence toxic interpretation of that relationship.
Hence patriarchy, actually.
Exactly.
Also.
So now I go in and say I emphasize him over her.
Because you guys have the potential to actually really disappear.
No. That understanding was not there. This understanding is
it's
now
a
for
current thing.
me to continue myself and to ensure that there's always 2 to make more babies. I need that one to be present. And at some point, it was, add to that toxic interpretation the variable of marriage. And then you say, okay, for 2 people to make babies, they need to be married. And then it makes it now, more inflamed in that because he is important biologically or maybe psychologically or however we feel we might be extinct, then it means he is the head of whatever is going to be formed in order to continue our life, right? Because he is more important. So this one is just a contributor.
And that's one, and because of that importance, that's why he can bring in another one and another one.
Well, to ensure that we get more of him, then let's get more of this thing going, right?
And it is more of him because it's him in that wife, it's him in that wife, it's him in that wife.
And I'm avoiding giving it names now because it means I'll be saying, oh, that's how patriarchy was born. That's how polygamy was born in the African context. I was not there. I don't know what was happening. All I'm seeing is
well, look at the biology aspect of it.
The male chromosome is more important, so we need to make more of it. And because now we underlay to the male, we sometimes then devalue the X chromosome, the female chromosome, and obviously we're not going to treat the female companion as important as the male companion. And then you add these other things to say, okay, if he then needs to procreate, then he would need the contribution of the X chromosome. Maybe let him take 2, maybe let him take 3. And because they are coming into his established societal, home or house, then they would then need to assume his identity, because in any case, when they give birth to more Y chromosomes, they will be assuming his
name.
Surname, right? And you draw the tree, you look at the biology, and then you say, okay, XY, it's my boy. My boy is supposed to make sure that my Y goes as far as possible. Then you say, okay, if he gives birth to 2 boys and 1 girl, this girl will go and contribute somewhere else. Exactly. So then the surname from the first point of departure then becomes inherited by these 2 boys who are supposed to pass it down, regardless of whether they give birth to an X and an X or an X and a Y, but they are actually passing down their identity, their surname. So therefore the surname of the father becomes the identity to assume. Unfortunately for the double X's, the females, while we're doing this whole thing and ensuring our survival into the future, we might also give you the surname of your father with the view that you might need to go marry somewhere someday. So you will then make a transfer to say when you get there you can take his surname because you are going to continue his heredity, his identity.
It explains also why historically it would be the males, the boys that would be sent to school, and the girls the only thing that the girls were good for was household chores, helping their mothers, and bringing ilobole ekhaya.
That's actually a more recent thing. A more ancient thing would be emphakathi in Swaziland, where the affairs of the community are decided. Then it would be males that go in there because they are the one that have these social structures called homes. Yes, and they are the ones who are supposed to continue now the recreation of these wives. So when communities meet to decide on the affairs of the community and the continuation thereof, then we kind of undervalue the double X's.
And the double X's were used to kwakha ubuhlobo, to create, to kwakha ubuhlobo. Uthi umntwana amantombazana ngamnikisa lapha kwamazia ayowenza. Mazia and myself will always be indebted to each other. We're always going to be family. So whatever happens, mina na Mazia, we protect each other because bo X bo Y ba Mazia baphuma kulabo X bala kwami.
So he has to make sure he takes care of me. And fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not sure, but that's how nations are built. And if you were to follow the history of how the Swazi nation was built specifically, I mean, with the Bantu migration and all of those other things, you find Uguti, where currently is Swaziland, there were other tribes that used to occupy those spaces, and how those tribes were integrated into the back then the Ngwane, tribe was through these axes that were given away, and for some reason the history is that maybe they had a certain appeal, as we all know, in Saswatini. I mean, the evidence is there.
The evidence is there.
Instead of warring and conquering and all of that, marriage would be the first tool to say let's build and grow this nation.
That is why also, if we're speaking specifically of Swaziland, things may have now gone pear-shaped, and there's really no understanding of why the king would have so many wives. It really was about maintaining the why, okay? Why the Y chromosome, Dlamini, Banbalakai, Bayakula, there's always going to be continuity of that royal family. Also, lokuthi athathe from likhaya nelikhaya ngilobudlelwane,
so
it's the formation of
becomes
so wonke umuntu usihlobo.
No one becomes an outsider. You don't have any relation to the royal crown.
Wonke umuntu usihlobo salakhaya. Makuthiwa kugidwa incwala, incwala yenkosi or incwala yesive, the national
because
prayer.
everyone is related.
Wonke umuntu is related lapha. That is actually what it was about. It actually is still what it's about. It's just that things have gotten so contaminated with so many things now. With capitalism has come to play such a big role in our existence now. So it's contaminated a lot of things. But the culture and it was beautiful when it was working. Because even the exes themselves were happy.
Exactly.
I think for me that is where inkinga ikhona khona is everybody should be satisfied, everybody should be happy, everybody should be getting something from it. Kungabi khona lo basesoba underdog. That is when then the problem starts, because then even the wise now coming from this ex, then they revolt. That is done. Noma ngabe lo ex usurvivile now physically, say, or experientially, akusasiko kuhle.
Exactly. And that's where toxicity becomes a problem. And remember, we said back then, at a molecular level, as soon as there's this life, as soon as there's a Y and an X, there's duality. So,
yes.
Also again, once there's an extreme interpretation of one side of the duality, there's always going to be problems. And this is where healers and healing come into play to harmonize everything. Our role is to ensure harmony so that the continuation is harmonious. And obviously, once there's harmony, there's growth, there's this, and there's that. So I wanted to finish the explanation of the levels of biological hierarchy, and then we can move to the next part of the conversation. So we said there's DNA, and then DNA forms chromosomes, chromosomes form cells. We're not going to get into the 23 pairs and da.
Because then we would be getting...
It's a biology class now.
We'd have to get into Down syndrome.
Exactly. Yeah, and then you have cells, and then cells would then form tissue, and then tissue would form organs, then organs would form systems, systems would form species, and then species would form, the ecology of it all. Yes. So when you and as Isangoma, once you have a view of that biology, your healing becomes targeted. It becomes, I don't want to say more efficient, because as umuntu agula, you can, classify the level of, the illness, where is it sitting, and then your healing can be focused on there. And that's where you encounter people with an identity crisis. For instance, the symptom is unesichitho or unamabhadi, and then if your treatment is towards amabhadi,
because we are treating the symptom.
You might as well have given him med lemon for flu. Because it's going to take away the runny nose, but the underlying factor remains. And with biology and spirituality is, the more you don't treat the source of the problem, the more inflamed the problem is. I mean, me and you spoke about emotional and spiritual inflammation. If it's God as its core or as its source, identity, which means the biology is not aligned to the psychology, is not aligned to the spirituality, and then it gives a certain symptoms to say, hey, whatever, and then we don't treat it correctly. It's like having a cut, and then that cut being soiled, and that wound not being clean. It can heal because the skin tissue will rush to close the source of the pain, but ivalela ngaphakathi ini lokungcola, and how your DNA would react, then it would build a lamp around it so that we can pinpoint where the problem is and then send more immune whatever responses to it. But it gets inflamed in such a way that instead of getting better, I mean, we've all had inflammation, whether tumbile or it was an infection sitting in your lungs. It's not nice, and the more you don't treat it, the worse it gets. People who've been to the ICU will tell you, but the deterioration, oh my God, deterioration from normal health to ill health is not nice. Add that spirituality, to that spirituality from someone who is level-headed, everything is fine, and then spiritually they digress. Spiritually, they fall ill. They become inflamed. And maybe just before we go to, because I'm thinking we're talking treatments now. Let's go back to how does spiritual inflammation come about?
That was an interesting conversation.
But before we get there, we need to, I think, as a point of departure, we need to go back to what life is and the different dimensions of life. In my view, and you can add your own as well. If you want to go, you can also add your own. So we have physical life, which is organic matter, organic life, which is body, meat, flesh, and all of that, right? So that's one dimension of life. And we know it because we can see it, we can interact with it, we can have an experience with it, right? And then there's psychological life. Psychological life is born out of
experience.
Yes, experience, but I wanted to trace it from there is who you are biologically and there is who you think you are psychologically.